Hello and welcome back to Born to Rant. I'm Brandon, and this week we are diving deep into one of the most infamous bombs in Hollywood history. A movie that had an insane production that included a near death by drowning, dueling reshoot units, and some of the most beautiful cinematography that never gets talked about. That's right, today we are diving deep into 1999's The 13th Warrior, directed by John McTiernan and starring Antonio Banderas, Vladimir Kulich, Dennis Storhøi, and Omar Sharif. We'll dive into the movie's insane production process and why it should have stuck to its original title, everything that makes the movie still worth watching, and its legacy over 25 years later. Now, I think this is a movie that I have a very similar relationship to as a lot of people around my age. I remember renting it right when it came out on VHS at a friend's house, not knowing it was a bomb and thinking it was really sick. I mean, it was dark and gritty and had people using swords, and I was a 9-year-old boy, so how was I ever not going to like this movie? Then I kinda didn't watch it again for 2 decades. I always remembered it as being pretty good, and then after getting more into movie production history, I learned about how this movie bombed and decided to give it a rewatch, and when I did, I'm not gonna lie to y'all, but I kind of hated it and thought it was mostly garbage. But before you get out your pitchforks, let me just say, when I decided to cover it for the channel and watched it again, I realized I'd been way too harsh after my last viewing. Is this movie perfect? Absolutely not. The story never quite coalesces, almost none of the characters have any distinct personality trait, and it's clear that this movie was shot to be PG-13 and then turned into an R-rated movie. But the vibes of this movie are just kind of immaculate. Specifically, the cinematography. The production focused on using a lot of natural light, and it resulted in some of the most underrated cinematography I've ever seen in any sort of major Hollywood bomb. But also, the set design here is insane, and I'm sure he would cringe at me saying this, but I was really reminded of Robert Eggers while rewatching this movie. Obviously, the amount of historically accurate details here pale in comparison to any Eggers movie, but I will say this movie feels like it's transporting me to a completely different time and place, something that I think Robert Eggers is really great at. And a big part of that is how the village looks once our heroes arrive to it. I also think that the costume design of the Wendell is really cool, with them really appearing as monsters until we start to see them close up. And I mean, the Wendell cave sequence is nothing short of brilliant. I mean, it's just awesome, from the design of the sets to the way McTiernan shoots them sneaking in. All of it just works. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back and learn a little bit more about how this movie came to be and its insane, nearly 2-year production. And it all begins, of course, with author Michael Crichton, who released the novel Eaters of the Dead in 1976 as a loose retelling of Beowulf from a historical point of view. Well, sort of. Though Crichton's book claims to be based on the actual events of Ahmad ibn Fadlan's life and the things he witnessed, this is really only half true. Yes, Fadlan was a real person who journeyed across the world and did write about his experiences encountering Volga Vikings, but pretty much everything else was completely made up by Crichton and inspired by Beowulf. And the book was a fairly decent hit for him right away, even being optioned to be turned into a movie in 1979 with Crichton directing. But this would fall apart, and it would take 2 more decades before the novel would finally make it to the big screen. It was in the mid-1990s that Eaters of the Dead was brought back into production over at Touchstone Pictures. They hired William Wisher Jr. and Warren Lewis to tackle the script, and both have a history of being uncredited rewriters, but Wisher is mostly known for a couple of movies he wrote with his friend James Cameron called The Terminator and Terminator 2. Ever heard of them? And McTiernan was brought on board after the success of Die Hard with a Vengeance, and he got to work and immediately started clashing with Michael Crichton over various aspects of the movie, because Crichton was a producer and had veto power over any and all parts of production. As for casting, originally it was Stellan Skarsgård that was eyed for the lead Viking, Bullywife. However, it ended up going to the only other actor that McTiernan met with, Vladimir Kulich. And as for the lead of the movie, originally McTiernan really wanted to cast Michael Keaton as the lead, but it of course ended up going to Antonio Banderas, who had just finished working on Zorro and had to quit Gladiator to come do this movie. And at first, it can be really easy to think that he clearly messed up by jumping over to the 13th Warrior from Gladiator. But the thing is that Gladiator also had a notoriously awful production, with the script being rewritten daily. It's just that that movie ended up working and this one didn't, but realistically, it could have gone either way. And in June of 1997, the 13th Warrior went into production with its original title, Eaters of the Dead, and a budget of $85 million. The production would film primarily in Vancouver, BC, on Vancouver Island, and if I haven't made it clear, production for this movie was an absolute nightmare. Antonio Banderas pitched a nerve and couldn't shoot for 2 weeks. Dennis Storhøi almost died when they filmed the swimming escape sequence. Banderas actually saved his life and said he was completely white when he pulled him out of the water, and anyway, Storhøi needed a couple of days off after that. There's also the fact that this movie was originally supposed to be PG-13, so McTiernan shot it like a PG-13 movie, avoiding blood and gore as much as possible. And principal production would wrap that October, and reports are that even at that point, McTiernan had gone way over budget. Then during test screenings, it was received so poorly that reshoots were ordered, and the crazy thing is that both John McTiernan and Michael Crichton directed the reshoots, but not together, completely separately. Coolidge has said that on set, he and the other Vikings were basically ping-ponging back and forth between the two directors, and they were both telling them not to give the other director their best stuff since it wouldn't make it into the movie anyway. Eventually, McTiernan was fully fired from the movie, and he saw the writing on the wall that this movie was not going to perform, so he got to work on his next movie, a remake of The Thomas Crown Affair, which ironically enough would be released the exact same month as The 13th Warrior, and would go on to be a pretty sizable hit, the last in McTiernan's career. Well, so far anyway. As far as the rest of post-production goes, this is also where the title was officially changed from Eaters of the Dead to The 13th Warrior. And this was after Michael Crichton's neighbor told him that he thought the title sounded like a horror movie, which, I mean, it's not a horror movie, but the title Eaters of the Dead just goes so much harder and actually works with what this movie ended up being. Which makes the fact that the studio insisted on ramping up the blood and gore to get an R rating that much more baffling. If you want to make the movie more horrific, why wouldn't you call it Eaters of the Dead? It truly makes no sense to me. There's also the fact that originally Graham Revell was set to do the score for this movie, and what he turned in had a lot of music that was inspired by Arabian culture, but of course this was scrapped by Disney at the last minute, and a more traditional score by Jerry Goldsmith was commissioned instead. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love me some Jerry Goldsmith, and I think the score in this movie is really strong. But I would be really curious to hear the original Revell score on this movie and see how it changes the overall vibe. As for the big changes made, it sounds like it was really just the beginning of the movie that was cut down, and then the studio chose the ending shot by Crichton. McTiernan also initially had the mother character played by Susan Willis, and the character was going to be an older, heavy-set woman, which is what is in the book. However, for some reason, Crichton got it in his head that them decapitating an old woman would make them less sympathetic characters. Truly, I do not understand that man's mindset when it came to making this movie. So anyway, Willis was replaced by Kristen Cloak, but Willis is still the one credited at the end of the movie. And finally, on August 27th, 1999, The 13th Warrior was released into theaters, and on its opening weekend, it placed second at the box office behind M. Night Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense, another Touchstone release by the way, and it made just $10.2 million against its final production budget of $160 million. Unfortunately, worldwide, this movie would only gross $61.6 million, making it one of the biggest bombs in Hollywood history. It also did not receive good critical reviews or audience reviews while it was in theaters. Although, like pretty much every movie we talk about on this channel, when it hit the home video market, it did very well and became a pretty sizable hit. Apologies for the interruption, but I wanted to jump in and say if you're enjoying the video so far, I just want to remind you that Born to Rant is a completely independent channel, and I use no AI in the making of my videos. And if that means anything to you, it would mean the world if you would like the video and subscribe to the channel. And with all of that out of the way, I think it's time for us to dive deep into The 13th Warrior and everything that makes it still worth watching in 2026.
You notice he's bigger than you?
Yes. Bet on him if you like.
I may!
If we're going to talk about what makes this movie still worth watching, it really boils down to the cinematography, set design, a few key scenes, and the really fun performance given by Dennis Storhøi as Herger the Joyous. Now, let's start with the excellent cinematography by Peter Menzies Jr., who's very much a working-class cinematographer, as you can tell looking through his filmography. And I love the way that he shot this movie with a real focus on natural light, especially these wide shots of the funeral, the Vikings traveling, the first time we see the fire serpent, And really the entire cave sequence, all of it just looks absolutely astounding and really gives this an old world feeling because of the lack of artificial lighting. Wolf Kroger's production design also really elevates the look of this movie, specifically King Hrothgar's village and the cave sequence. I mean, the cave is just so cool. As for the scenes that make this movie, I actually really like all of the opening stuff, with Banderas narrating and telling us about how he was exiled from Baghdad for sleeping with someone else's wife. Also, side note, hilarious to see Banderas playing an Arab. Cool to see a Muslim be the main character though. Honestly, I wish the beginning had been explored a little bit more. I would have loved to see a 10-minute prologue of Banderas hooking up with this dude's wife and then getting caught and exiled. There's also the few scenes we get with Omar Sharif early in the movie where he's working as a translator, and apparently it was a conscious effort to put Sharif in white and Banderas in black as a little reverse homage to Lawrence of Arabia. I also love the early scenes with the Vikings. I think they're really fun, especially the Viking funeral, and of course the passing of the bowl of water is hilarious and disgusting. The first real standout moment of the movie though is when the warriors are being selected to go on their quest, and the way the quiet falls over the entire room when the wise woman says that the only way the quest will be successful is if there are 13 warriors and one of them is not a Northman, which of course means that Banderas is going on the quest. We also have to talk about him learning their language in one night by watching them talk around the fire. It is both brilliant and stupid. Like, from a realistic point of view, no one is learning a language overnight by just watching people talk around a campfire. I don't care how many languages they speak, but as a storytelling device in a movie, it's pretty brilliant. Honestly, the only time I've seen something like this done better with languages switching to English is in The Hunt for Red October, which was of course also directed by John McTiernan. Once the crew reach King Hrothgar's kingdom, we get a lot of preparation and fighting sequences, just one right after the other. Now, I have to admit, even though they look beautiful, I do not love how McTiernan shot the battle sequences for this movie. It's very wide and dark, and you can't really see what's going on. It ends up just looking like a lot of people chopping and not really choreographed action. Obviously, there are two exceptions to this, and that is Herger's duel with the older prince's friend, which is really just one of the many standout moments that Storhøi has throughout the movie, although the subplot with the prince is one that's completely abandoned after this fight scene, which I guess isn't that strange considering our heroes have asserted their dominance, but whatever. The other exception is when our heroes finally sneak into the Wendell's cave. Everything about this sequence just rocks. From our heroes entering the cave with torches and having to crawl through a room full of Wendell, to the creepy ass bone room, and the waterfall sequence might actually be my favorite sequence in the entire movie. It's fun and tense, and who doesn't love seeing a good waterfall in a movie, am I right? Plus the fight with the Wendell as Bully Wife sneaks away to behead the mother is fantastic as well. And even though I do think they should have kept the original mother in, I do think the beheading is still sick as hell, and the escape from the cave is just thrilling. Now, I do have to admit, from this point to the end of the movie, the story does begin to lose me a little bit. I do think it's fine that Bully Wife has been poisoned and is going to die, and I don't even mind the final battle sequence. But what I don't love is the final showdown with the character we've had absolutely zero interaction with throughout the entire movie. I just don't think it quite ends on the strongest note it could have. I really liked McTiernan's original ending, which was the battle lasting until morning, and then the Wendell begins screaming, and Ahmad realizes that they're actually saluting the Vikings, and then they disappear into the mist. I just think that would have been a much stronger ending.
Goodbye, Arab!
Goodbye, Northman.
So, 25 plus years later, what is the legacy of the 13th Warrior? Well, like I said, it's still considered to be one of the biggest bombs in Hollywood history. And even though it failed and had a crazy production, both John McTiernan and Michael Crichton have gone on record saying that for the most part, they were really happy with how the movie turned out. John McTiernan has even said that his cut would maybe be 10 minutes longer and feature just a few alternative takes. After the movie came out, Omar Sharif also put out a very dramatic statement about doing movies just for the money, and then he would take a break from acting for a few years before returning to Hollywood for one final movie, Hidalgo. There was also a Blu-ray released in 2011 via France, and it featured an hour-long featurette with Banderas, Coolidge, and McTiernan giving interviews about the making of the movie. Honestly, it was a huge help when doing research for this video. But other than that, The 13th Warrior feels largely forgotten. People who grew up in the 90s vaguely remember it as being a pretty solid little movie, but it's not really a movie you hear talked about all that often. And I get it, it has a lot of problems, but honestly, I would rather watch this movie on a loop than ever watch Gladiator 2 again. For For me, the biggest tragedy of the movie is that Dennis Storhøi didn't end up in more English language movies, because I think this guy's charisma is just off the charts throughout the entire movie. But let me know what you think in the comments. Do you love this movie? When was the last time you watched it? Can we all agree that this movie should have just been called Eaters of the Dead? If you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching, and as always, a very special thank you to my supporters on Patreon who really help keep the lights on over here at Born to Rant. There's a link to the Patreon in the description below if you'd like to learn about the benefits of being a patron. Don't forget that Born to Rant is a completely independent channel, so you liking the video and subscribing to the channel really helps me out. And here's where I would usually say that we release new videos every Thursday at 7 a.m. Pacific time, but I recently got laid off from my day job, so in the coming weeks, I'm going to start experimenting with posting 2 videos a week, so give me some time to play around with that schedule format, and that's it for Born to Rant this week. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.